This is a public record podcast on CPAC, the Cable Public Affairs channel. On September 18th in Toronto, key stakeholders, military leaders, and academics gathered to explore challenges and opportunities in the Arctic at the Mackenzie Institute's Canadian Arctic Conference. In the closing keynote address, former NORAD Commander, retired US General Glen Vanherck, outlines the current state of continental defense and the challenges in detecting, defending against, and deterring threats.
What a good-looking crowd, at least most of you. There are a few characters out there. I'm looking at data, and Scott Clancy already left, so really. For those of you that just arrived, you really missed some interesting discussions today, but hopefully I can kind of wrap it all up with you tonight. I'd like to thank the Mackenzie Institute and Brian Hay. Thank you very much, Brian, for asking me. And I think we ought to recognize those here at the Albany Club that have served us, provided a meal. Outstanding job. Thank you. So earlier, Scott Clancy sent a note on LinkedIn to me, to everybody. He said it was actually an advertisement for this event. And he said he's honored to be able to get to be back with his old boss. And I'm like, I'm not really old. I'd rather be called your former boss or something like that. So as I look at this crowd, I'm not going to say anybody's old, but it's nice to see youngsters over here that are here witnessing, being part of this discussion. And thanks for all of you being here. Thank you. You know, the discussion today really highlights the complexities of the challenges we face, not only in defending North America, but that we see across the globe today. They're as complex as I've ever seen. I served 37 years. The Canadians would say they served 41 years because they count their time in their military college, but 37 years on active duty. And I've never seen an environment as challenging, as dynamic as what we have today. And I can't tell you how honored it was for me to be the 26th commander of NORAD and the 9th commander of United States Northern Command. When I took command of NORAD on the 20th of August of 2020, Jonathan Vance handed me the flag, the CDS at the time. And after that meeting, he pulled me into a room and told me how important NORAD was to the Canadian people. Well, I took that to granted. I understand how important it is. The Canadian people understand the value of NORAD and what NORAD brings to the defense of North America and the defense of our continent, candidly. But the U.S. people haven't quite figured that out. I'll just be candid with you. There's a lot of people that don't understand what NORAD actually does, and I can't tell you how many times in my previous position where I would get senior department folks who would say, give that to the commander of NORTHCOM, when it was actually a NORAD mission. And I took that very, very seriously. So separate bosses, separate authorities. You saw Scott Clancy tell you who I worked for, the CDS and the Secretary of Defense in my NORAD hat, and the Secretary and the President of the United States in my NORTHCOM hat. But separate, what I like to say is inseparable commands. And they truly are inseparable. And I'll just give you one example. So NORAD provides maritime warning. NORAD tracks hundreds of vessels on a day-to-day basis, vessels that may be intelligence collectors, vessels that may be threats to North America. They may have hazardous chemicals on board. Average 150 to 200 a day. If those are a threat to North America, then I prosecute them in my NORTHCOM hat. But the moment a vessel fires a missile, I put my NORAD hat back on to engage that missile with my NORAD hat. And if that missile were to strike in the United States, I would put my NORTHCOM hat back on to respond defense of civil authorities and support. So they're truly inseparable, and that's what I like to say. There is no mission more noble than waking up every day and defending North America and your homeland. And I had the privilege of doing that for 3.5 years. I also had the privilege of every year tracking Santa Claus. Okay? That mission is the largest outreach program in the entire Department of Defense, and I would venture to say in Canada as well, reaching millions of people. And it gives us the opportunity to tell the story and the value of NORAD. You know, I started my interviews with the media every morning at 4 o'clock to tell the story of how we track Santa Claus, but it's really how we actually track threats to North America on a daily basis. And so, really important. When I got there on the 20th of August in 2020, in the middle of COVID, my team approached me about canceling NORAD Track Santa, and I said, I'm not going to be the guy that cancels Christmas. You know, not going to happen. I wish at the end of my command I could say I left the world a safer place, but you can't say that candidly. The world is a dangerous place right now. North America is a dangerous place, actually. We're under attack every day in the cyber domain and the information space, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The things that we did really well, Scott Clancy talked about them, and Data did as well. That's Elaine Peltier. Data, that's who he is to me. We had a great strategy. We put that together. I'll give you some detail on that. To execute a strategy, you have to have a campaign plan, an XOR to make it happen. And I think we did a really good job with that. We operationalized the commands. We stood up a joint operations center. You saw on Scott Clancy's slide, he had the N2C2, which was the NORAD Northcom Command Center. What I found was we were doing operations on a day-to-day basis, and the N2C2 at that time was not ready to do operations on a daily basis. So we stood up a joint operations center. I was the only combatant commander of the United States that didn't have a joint operations center, and we stood that up with the help of Canadians, and that really matters. A global culture. I don't see any regional problems anymore. The problems that we face today are global in nature, and they're all domain in nature. China is not a problem in the Indo-PACOM AOR in the Western Pacific. China is a problem right here in North America. It is a problem in South America. It is a problem in Central America and Africa. And so we wanted to instill a global culture and approach the problem sets with a global mindset. The problem is that we're organized, whether it's in DOD, State Department, I would venture to say Global Affairs Canada, by regions of the globe. And they create stovepipes where we don't talk about the challenges and create options that work for a global problem set. And I can give you examples of that right now. One of those is the sanctions we issued on Russia. Actually strategically probably had worse consequences in many cases than we could ever imagine, such as bringing China closer to Russia because now they gain access to cheap oil because Russia needs something to sell it for economic purposes. Iran steps up to sell drones to Russia. Iran takes that money and funds Hezbollah and Hamas. DPRK steps up now to fund Russia's military, and what do they get? They get nuclear secrets and ICBM secrets. Is that the best strategic outcome? That was probably created in many ways by a regional approach to a problem instead of approaching that from a global perspective is strategically what do we need to happen and what is the outcome. Now, I'm not saying sanctions aren't valuable. What I'm saying is we need to make sure the second and third order effects of those are not strategic impacts that are worse than what we were looking for in the first place. I believe we created fantastic relationships. What I would say is on the U.S. side with our Federal Emergency Management Area, who helps me as the Northcom Commander conduct basically continuity of government mission and response to hurricanes, wildfires, anytime there's a civil authority, whether it was an attack on our homeland. And we connected Public Safety Canada with our FEMA to make sure those relationships exist. Great friends with Bob Octoloni of CJOC. Is he still in command? Okay, he's gone. Fantastic relationships, CANSOF, cyber. I mean, those things are important. With the NATO countries of the Arctic, a lot happening. Those relationships really matter. But we do need to improve some things, and I'll talk more detail on that. Policy is one of them. Everybody wanted to do my job. I had the cool job, the operational job, employment of forces. What we need policymakers to do is provide policy. And oftentimes the policy is lacking. I'll talk more about that here in a moment. A sense of urgency, infrastructure, domain awareness, data and information, resiliency, the defense industrial base, Those are things that we need to focus on and stay in the course for our national defense strategy and strong and secure and engaged at the time, vice allowing the small things around the globe that are not existential threats to the United States or Canada detract from staying the course on the national defense strategy. And what we see that is happening is in the Middle East, and we need a new strategy in the Middle East, candidly. A large conventional force in the Middle East is not what it's going to take. It takes a Title 50 for us, a special operations, our Central Intelligence Agency, your soft forces, as well, and along with our allies and partners. But a large conventional force is just not sustainable. The readiness it erodes, the capability. We have worn out a fleet of AWACS, fighter jets, and everything else for 30 years in the Middle East, as have you. And so we need a different strategy as we go over there. I would tell you the world order is being challenged, and I know Leona may not agree necessarily that that's something to talk about, but I would tell you the world order that has served us well since the end of World War II, that has prevented great powers from going to conflict, is under attack. More importantly, the international laws and norms and behaviors and the standards that have served us well is under attack and trying to be changed. And we see that in the Arctic right now and many of the discussions we had earlier today. Why? The PRC, Russia want to gain influence. This is influence warfare. Access to minerals, resources, change those norms and behaviors and laws to favor them economically. That is ongoing in front of us. Don't think about defending the Arctic necessarily as defending it from men and women in green uniforms that are going to plant and land on the ice cap. That's not what we're defending. We're defending our way of life. We're defending the norms, the laws that have stood us good since the end of World War II. That's what's under attack right now. Now, I'll talk more about what you do need to defend here in just a moment. Okay. I would tell you that our democracies are being undermined every day. You see that in the information space, through cyber, through social media. The culture of our kids is being manipulated through social media by external actors that change and develop them to think differently than the way our democracies maybe want them to see. I would tell you that the internal strife that we see in the United States, and I would venture in Canada, is being perpetuated by external actors, and we need to realize that. We fight amongst ourselves. That's what they want. That's what the PRC, Russia, Iran want, and they create friction internal to us. So we need to make this not about party. We need to make it about the countries. It's about North America and our national security. And when we look at that, we'll make the right decision. And I would ask you to really think about that. Under attack every day. So cyber. The PRC is gaining incredible knowledge every day by taking data, intellectual property out of our academic institutions, our fine companies that they come and serve. You heard it earlier. They come over here with a responsibility to provide information back on what's going on. More importantly, when I say our democracies are being undermined, it's absolutely true. You know, what happened, in the United States with civil unrest and the many challenges that we faced is a challenge that we need to realize that others are permeating for our country. I would tell you that strategic stability is eroding every single day. And the risk of strategic deterrence failure is going up every day. Every single day. I don't see a good outcome in Ukraine. Does anybody? Tell me what it is. The outcome I would love to see is Putin goes home with his tail between his legs. That's not going to happen.
Yes, it is.
The glass is half full over here. That's what I want to happen. But so the outcomes, if you settle with Putin, you give part of Ukraine away, Putin wins. That is not a good plan. He was allowed to change international laws and behaviors and norms. And what comes next? The PRC is watching, okay? If Putin's going to lose, the potential of escalation is there. I wish I could tell you, standing here, that I see a good outcome. I don't see a good outcome. Let's pray for a good outcome. I tell you this all because I would say that NORAD's mission is in demand and more relevant than it ever has been. In the height of the Cold War, NORAD had more than 1,500 fighters. Do you know how many fighters I had as the NORAD commander? A couple dozen. Okay? That's it. And the world is more dangerous today, oftentimes, than what we had. We need to educate folks on what the Arctic, what NORAD brings, what the Arctic brings, what it matters. I had somebody in my headquarters who I was briefing with significant influence over the budget in the Department of Defense after we briefed about NORAD, NORTHCOM missions, look at me and say, why would we invest in defense in the Arctic? Nobody lives there. Okay, we have some education to do, folks, on why the Arctic matters. So the question was posed to me, can Canada defend its own Arctic interests? Brian gave me that question. Well, you bring an American to tell you that? Come on. I'm not going to tell you yes or no, but I would tell you as the commander of NORAD, I had significant concerns about my ability to execute the missions that I was given by the government of Canada, the government of the United States. And I'll tell you why here in just a second. First is domain awareness, and you've heard that. You cannot deter or defeat something you cannot detect. And when I say domain awareness, I'm talking from undersea to on sea to on land to in the air to in space and cyberspace. And you can say, well, NORAD only does the air mission. Well, no, that's not true. We have a mission from space, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We have a maritime mission, and all of those, command and control, are impacted potentially by cyber, and we rely on communications-based, land-based and space-based, and we track vessels under the sea. So all of that matters to the NORAD mission. Persistence and presence. You know, the DoD has a new strategy, and I've talked to some of you about this, for the Arctic. They just put it out. They had a strategy in 2019. The problem is the strategy is irrelevant if no resources are applied to it. No resources were really applied to that. And the same thing is true for NORAD, candidly, from the Canadians, okay? And you've heard that from multiple people. They just put out a new strategy, DoD being they. That strategy has a moniker, if you will, of monitor and respond. That is the strategy. What I read into that is essentially do nothing, okay? So monitor. If you don't have the domain awareness, and if you don't have the persistence of forces, how can you monitor? And if you don't have forces capable of operating in the Arctic that are readily available, then how do you respond? Okay, so that strategy in my mind is lacking and needs to move forward. So challenges that I faced, capacity, capability, the human aspect. We need to do R&D on the human operating in the Arctic and make more efficient clothing, survival systems, much more. And we heard about that a little bit earlier. A lot of folks believe that as the commander of NORAD, I had 23,000 forces in Alaska and several hundred fifth-gen fighters to respond to threats in the Arctic. Actually, those forces all belong to the commander of Indo-PACOM. Not one of those forces is assigned to the commander of NORAD or NORTHCOM on a day-to-day basis. And guess what, folks? They're all planned to go to the Indo-Pacific AOR in a fight with China, and they're all planned to go to the European AOR in a fight with Russia. What is left behind? Nothing. What comes behind? Nobody that's organized, trained, and equipped. And that's something I've been advocating for. You can ask a question, but Brian may get mad at you.
So basically what you're saying is that they did that to squeeze the real estate space on getting from A to Z. It wasn't about looking at the Arctic. They were using it as a launch pad.
So I would tell you that Alaska is one of the most strategic locations on the planet for deployment to Europe, for deployment to the Pacific, minerals, for observation of multiple things. So those forces are in a great place. The challenge is the command and control relationship, and they're in my AOR when I was the commander, but they're not assigned to me. And so everybody's perception is, well, you've got all those forces. No, those forces were Admiral Aquilino's at the time, and they were going to go to a different command. Now we need to provide forces to backfill them that are organized, trained, and equipped and ready to operate in the Arctic. and those forces did not exist. That's a challenge we must address. So I believe we must defend our interest in the Arctic. The Arctic is vital to economic prosperity, stability, everything that we need to do. I told you earlier, I believe the Arctic is a place where there's potential friction over resources, friction over land claims, friction over economic aspects of flow through the Northwest Passage, et cetera. And even the United States and Canada have friction over claims in the Arctic. Is the Northwest Passage international waters, or is it Canadian internal waters? We ought to come to grips on that and move forward with a strategy that allows us to be strategically successful, irrelevant of what it is. And for the United States, I would tell you, we have to be able to apply that decision globally, not specific to one problem set, but globally. And I think that's the challenge we're facing now. Okay, so I would tell you the world is starving for leadership, especially in the West right now. The question is, who's going to step up and lead? Or are we going to step up and lead, especially in the Arctic? And we must. If we don't, someone will. And that someone right now is proven to be the PRC globally. You know, the United States has oftentimes ignored Central and South America. I can tell you the PRC is active there. They're active in Africa right now. They're active around the globe. If we don't lead, Western nations don't lead, they will. So the world as I see it today. Brian, I'll try to keep us on time, okay? We don't. Shock and awe, Desert Storm, truly was shock and awe to the PRC, to Russia. They watched how the West took 6 months, flowed forces, and then really opened up a can of you-know-what on the Iraqi forces, using space-based capabilities, precision-guided weapons, speed, agility. And they said, we have got to develop capabilities to hold that force flow at risk, below the nuclear threshold, so that we can delay and disrupt and terminate any potential crisis on our terms, not their terms, or destroy the will of the U.S. and Canadian people. That's what they have developed in capabilities. Russia is the primary military threat to North America and our homeland. Let me tell you a story. So when I first took over in January, we had a new administration come in. And they came up with a new national defense strategy. And the national defense strategy came out, and the first version that came to me to coordinate on as a combatant commander did not have Russia addressed as a threat. And I said, I non-concur. I will not concur with this document. And we went round and round. There's one reason that the Russians are listed as an acute threat in the national defense strategy. That's because I would not relent on that. And they put it in there. Guess what? Where are we now? With significant challenge. Russia is the primary military threat from a capability, military standpoint. China is the long-term, existential, economic, those types of things. The two of them getting together, we must ask ourselves, and history will look back on, did we force them together? Did we force the DPRK, Iran closer together? I'll let history judge that. But that's a significant challenge. Recently, we've seen them flying together. We've seen them sailing together. That's all strategic messaging. I don't get too concerned about that, to be candid with you. But there was big talk about the Russians and the Chinese flying together in the Alaskan ADIZ recently. They've been flying together for a while in the Sea of Japan, down the South China Sea, et cetera. What was concerning to me about them flying together was that the Chinese actually deployed their bombers, their personnel, to Russia, to the far eastern bases in Russia, and flew those missions out of Russia, now putting them within reach of North America. That's what is concerning to me about that partnership. Prior to that, the Chinese did not have the ability to reach forward. So the missions you heard about earlier, aerospace warning, I think is the most strategic mission that NORAD has. Do you realize that any missile launched anywhere on the planet, NORAD has a given amount of time, and it's in a few minutes, to identify, is that missile a threat to North America? And we have the ability in a sense network to do that. That is being challenged today, the ability to provide that warning, okay? It's being challenged by hypersonic capable weapons, for example. A ballistic missile is simple. It follows a ballistic path, and physics is real simple. It's going to fall here. Radars and satellites can tell you that. But hypersonic weapons maneuver, and they can maneuver below our existing radars. Why do we provide aerospace warning? Number one, for continuity of government. Probably the most strategic thing that we do. That's our decision makers for nuclear response, et cetera. And the second thing is to survive our nuclear forces and our nuclear force posture. Okay, that mission is really strategic, and it's being challenged today, and I would tell you, I'm going to have a hard time as a former commander telling you we can do that mission. Very, very important. Cruise missiles. Before, the bomber had to fly over and drop gravity weapons. Today, Russians can shoot cruise missiles from over Russia, take off, get airborne in those bases in eastern Russia, fire those cruise missiles and strike your cities in Canada and some cities in the United States. And those cruise missiles are low radar cross-section. They're maneuverable, and they know exactly where the North Warning System is, and they make the North Warning System look like a picket fence, and they can fly through them. Again, hard to provide that warning that we're talking about. Those cruise missiles can be launched off submarines, they can be launched off sea-based platforms, they can be launched off land platforms, air platforms, and multiple, and we've seen recently fractional orbital bombardment systems, space-based, dropping hypersonic capable weapons that can be orbited and deorbit on a moment's notice, and the only indication you get is a re-entry. Now, many people think, well, hypersonic missiles, what makes them tough is they're so fast. They're not as fast as a ballistic missile that falls out like a normal ICBM. What makes them tough is their maneuverability and the ability to fly below radars that are designed to detect them. The radars all point towards a given threat, primarily to the north. If you can sail a submarine off the east or west coast of North America or south, you're getting weapons coming inbound that we're not designed to see. That ought to concern us all. Aerospace control, I want to talk about that real quick. That's a capacity problem. 1,500 fighters in the 70s, today down to a few dozen. And those fighters, many of them today, are programmed to go elsewhere. So we have a capacity problem to defend North America. They're planned for other things. We have an infrastructure problem. One of the things I focused on heavily was the ability to fight from and within our homeland. Some of the panels earlier talked about it. This is a warfighting AOR, and it needs to be thought of that way. But we're not set up. I would tell you our bases are not organized to do combat turns, effective defense. Our submarine, our sea bases are not set up to operate in a wartime environment. We're set up to fight forward. We have a 9/11, post-9/11 posture, and we need to think differently about the threats. The maritime threat. I'll just tell you candidly, the Russians are on their way to fielding 9 SEV submarines, 5 in the Northern Fleet, which will be in the Atlantic, and 4 in the Pacific. Scott Clancy alluded to this being a yearly problem. This is no longer a yearly problem. This is a daily problem where they can be off your coast. Very challenging to detect, oftentimes going weeks and months unknown. So how I approached this problem, I had a long time to think about it. I shaped the commands, wanted people to think about warfighting AOR, operationalize them, to think about this is where we're going to fight from and we need to be ready, and integrating them. I created a single strategy. We had 2 strategies, a NORAD and a NORTHCOM strategy, and merged them into a single strategy with a single campaign plan to generate single common goals and effects. I had a deterrence focus, not a defeat, in-game defeat, deterrence. That was my plan. You know, what I believe is every day, if you can demonstrate readiness, responsiveness, capability, and resiliency, and any potential adversary looks here and sees that, they're less likely to take any action. Now, we do need to defend some things, but it is not everything. And like Scott said, if you try to defend everything, you defend nothing. And so I asked for policy from the United States and Canada. It took the United States 2 years to give me policy, and Canada never gave me policy in 3.5 years on what to defend, and just as important, from what. You do not have to defend everything. But there are certain things that are critical that can bring you to your knees in a time of crisis or conflict that you probably want to defend. And when I say defend, do not think of in-game shoot everything down. It may be that you just harden it. It may be that it's just cyber defense because it's not in a position. It may be you use deception to make somebody believe you have a capability to defend. And the next thing is we're going to focus on campaigning every day to demonstrate that readiness and resiliency. The challenge was getting forces to execute the strategy, getting forces to execute the plan. I get it, the Arctic is tough. My own United States Air Force, no, we can't do that. Why? It's cold and tough, dark, etc. Guess what? We need to be in the Arctic and we need to defend the Arctic. So strategic priorities that I had: domain awareness, information dominance, decision superiority, and global integration. Domain awareness, I've already talked to you about that one. Information dominance is really important. And that's the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and capabilities to create time and decision space. The only thing I could never give the Prime Minister, the President, the CDS, or the SecDef enough of was time and decision space. And the only way you create more time and decision space is you take information and data and you process it faster and you disseminate it to decision makers. And that creates the opportunity now to create deterrence options, or if required, defeat options. Think about a deterrence option as me as an operational commander maneuvering forces to send a message. It may be that Justin Trudeau picks up the telephone and sends a message to Putin with a deterrence option. But if you don't have decision space to do that, the risk of escalation goes up. That's where I was focused. Decision superiority is disseminating that. From the strategic level, think POTUS, think Prime Minister, all the way to the tactical level, think shooter on the end. That's where we need to be. And executing the campaign to demonstrate that readiness and responsiveness. And the most important thing is resiliency. If I could give Canada some advice, if I was asked, I would tell you the first thing that I would tell your Prime Minister, and I have told several of your ministers and a couple of your CDSs, is number one, need to see a sense of urgency of the people, of your government about this problem set. And I would say the same thing in the United States. I think we have an education problem, and we need to do a better job, and you've heard several people talk about that. I applaud your new defense policy update. Words are really cheap. Action and execution is what matters, and that's what I'm looking for right now. When I talk sense of urgency, it was sitting there, and it being the DPU, since 2022, waiting to be put out. And I don't know what they're waiting for, but I'm on the other end going, I need policy. I need you to tell me where we're going. That's a lack of sense of urgency. I would not get focused on 2% NATO commitment. I would advise your leaders that you need to focus this on threat-based capabilities. What does Canada need to do to make sure you have national security to defend your way of life, the things that matter to you? That may be 1.5%. That may be 5%. I don't know what it is. But 2% was pulled out of the air by somebody, and that number is probably changing right now. I applaud the announcement of 12 submarines, but read into it, folks. It says up to 12 submarines. That may be one submarine. I would send a different message. If I were advising you, I would say we're going to buy enough submarines to defend the East Coast, the West Coast, and the Arctic. And I wouldn't tell anybody what that number is. Now, you may have to do something different, but that's the way I would approach it. But when you say up to 12, guess what everybody else is thinking? That's 4, okay? Words in there, and I've read it, say things like, we will explore, we will consider, instead of we will do this in concrete. That's my advice. This is a huge area where Canada can lead, especially the submarines, especially with the help of continental defense. You know, the U.S. submarine force is way overtasked. I don't know if you know how many submarines we have, but it's several dozen, 50-something, plus our boomers. And they're all around the globe. Canada could do a lot right here with submarines that can help do anti-submarine warfare, that can help campaign on a day-to-day basis. Airborne warning and command and control platform. We're going to have a multi-year gap without AWACS because we wore the AWACS out and the E7 can't be delivered on time. I think this is a great opportunity for Canada to lead and step forward with airborne warning and control and also anti-submarine platforms, whether that's a P-8 or something else, to move forward. We need to think differently about things such as search and rescue and combat search and rescue. The joint force, at least in the United States, is woefully lacking for combat search and rescue around the globe right now. Canada could help. When I say think differently, what I'm talking about is the Arctic is vastly different when it comes to search and rescue. It's a perfect place for uncrewed, unmanned platforms. Rather than think of go out and pick them up in the golden hour, it may be that we take an uncrewed platform that's loitering while we're executing missions, and that uncrewed platform could fly over a downed air crew or a maritime force and drop out survival capability to enable somebody to survive for 24 hours until you can actually get in there and get them. But we don't think differently about the problem set, and we need to make sure we do that. Uncrewed platforms offer incredible capability in the Arctic, by the way, and you don't have to launch them in the Arctic. Many of them are capable of loitering for days. There are solar-powered uncrewed platforms now. They have the capability. Now, it's dark up there sometimes, we know that, but there are other ways to approach this problem and think differently. You need to think about data and information and joint all-domain and command and control. And how are you going to set up communications in a time of crisis? I would tell you we're all vulnerable right now to make sure that we have communication systems that can survive an EMP attack, a cyber attack. The way we're going to be efficient and effective is to be able to communicate, to share information and data, and that's important. Supply chain. I want to talk to you about the supply chain. One of the things I learned during COVID as the NORAD Commander, where I was responsible for providing COVID support for the Department of Defense across 40-something hospitals and administering vaccines, was about 80% of our pharmaceuticals come from China. About 85% of our personal protective equipment comes from China. Our critical minerals that you heard about. Just this week, just a couple days ago, China ceased exporting some critical minerals that are utilized in the development of batteries and other things that we probably ought to consider national security imperatives. And we ought to develop a new way forward to make sure that supply chains are going to be there as we go forward. So I think this is a chance to lead the U.S., especially with NORAD modernization. It's a chance to lead the globe rather than follow. You know, no insult here, but Canada has oftentimes waited for the U.S. You can step out right now and continue with over-the-horizon radar, move forward on submarines, move forward on resiliency of your critical infrastructure, and I'm not talking DoD critical infrastructure. Get the policy and what are those things we must defend and make sure that your critical infrastructure is safe and secure. That's something we need to do as well. And I say that because that's crucial to strategic deterrence. When I say strategic deterrence, how many of you think nuclear? I don't see any hands. That's good. Nuclear is a subset, in my mind, of strategic deterrence. Okay, strategic deterrence, we have to have that nuclear piece of it, okay? I think that's the foundation of our defense. But strategic deterrence is so much more than that. It's our resiliency. It's our demonstrated capability on a day-to-day basis. And the foundation of it is actually the information space. Okay, you can demonstrate through overt. You can demonstrate it through covert ways. You can use clandestine, pass information through diplomats. The foundation of my strategy was a solid information plan. But I'll be candid with you. I was asked to throttle it back in the information space oftentimes from Canada because they didn't want me to get out in front to talk about China, to talk about the threats. I came here early in my tenure and I did an interview with the media. I was very candid with the media here in Canada. I was never asked again to talk to the media. When I say we have an education problem, that's what I was trying to do. We should educate. So, concerns. Execution of your defense policy update. And I'm about done. I know you want to go home. I'm worried that integration, sequencing, execution, staff manning to implement it, where you don't have the manning to manage and juggle all the things that you're planning to do. I worry that the defense industrial base does not have the capacity to produce what Canada needs, what the U.S. needs, based on Ukrainian actions. There's much more. The sequencing of it, it is really easy to say we're going to buy an F-35 or we're going to buy the submarine, but what comes with that is a gigantic training pipeline, security, logistics, much more. When I looked at my NORAD mission, when I talk infrastructure, when I talk logistics, I said earlier we're set up for a post-9/11 type environment. We're not ready to fight in and from our homeland. So most of the bases that we would need to fight from have days worth of fuel and no weapons on them. And at times of the year, you're not going to replenish them because of the ice. These are things we need to think through sooner than later. Defense industrial base, the workforce to support it. My father had a PhD in industrial education. He taught welding, machine shop, woodworking, electronic, all the things that are skilled labor today. We went through a period where everybody needs to go to college or university. Right now, we're paying that bill because we don't have the workforce to stand up our shipbuilding, everything that we need. Those are things we need to invest in right now that create concern for me. Is anybody worried about nuclear proliferation right now? I see a few hands. I am too. Why? I'm talking about proliferation amongst potential threats, but also allies and partners. There's a reason there's no Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, conventional boots. Why is it? It's called nuclear weapons. Don't kid yourself. And so if you're sitting around the globe and you see that, and you're in the Middle East or you're in Asia or you're somewhere, you're going to go, I got to get me some of those. That concerns me tremendously. And we should keep our eye on that as we go forward. I worry about the authoritarian regimes, primarily of the PRC. And by the way, when we say PRC, it's really the Chinese Communist Party, okay, the CCP. The people of China are not the problem, and the minority is really the CCP. And they're more worried about keeping themselves in power and will do almost anything to do that. I worry about Russia and the party there and the DPRK. And now the new leadership in Iran is authoritarian regimes. We tend to mirror image that they think like us. I hear people say, I wonder what Putin's red line is. I would probably say, I don't think he has a red line. He's probably got a jar that's being filled up, and at some point the jar is going to overflow. And it's not one thing. It's a combination of multiple things that led to deterrence failure. And that's the way we ought to think about it. That's different than the way we think about it. It's not an individual event. But I worry about them because they really don't have anything to lose. They may pop off that nuke. That's concerning. So the way forward, I'd tell you relationships matter now more than ever. The asymmetric advantage that we have is a network of allies and partners and like-minded nations around the globe that think like us, see like us. Our allies and partners, our alliances, have kept us out of great power conflict. Now is not the time to put up Fort North America. Now is the time to lead globally and ensure that we value diplomacy, the economic aspect. Military should not be the easy button. It should be the last resort on a day-to-day basis. Strong strategic deterrence. That's what keeps great powers from going to war. That resiliency, cyber, and the messaging that we talked about. I would tell you the Arctic does matter tremendously. We need to keep that in mind, and we need to invest in our homelands. Everybody thinks the fight is somewhere else. We're under attack here, and we need to invest right now and get that policy on what to defend and from what. Let me just close by a couple things. We have the finest military forces on the planet. Despite what you may see in the news, let's not kid ourselves. Most everybody wants to be like Western nations. We have the finest forces on the planet. What you see on the news, especially in the United States, is politics in action. Let's just call it like it is. So let me end. While I'm concerned, I'm confident that we can prevail and we can move forward, but it's going to take education and it's going to take action right away. And we must act sooner than later. So God bless all of you, Canada and the United States of America. Thank you.